WULF, who's one of the leading figures in English heathenism, who spoke to this group a number of occasions before. So I would say we have had Orthodox, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim and heathen speakers, from which you can see that we value diversity. We certainly allow rather more free speech than is permissible in conventional circles. WULF's going to speak to us this afternoon about the myth or story of Atlantis. I don't know what he's going to say. I'm looking forward with interest to finding out. So
yes, I'm going to speak on the myth of Atlantis actually, rather than the story of Atlantis. I think most people are probably sort of aware of the legend of Atlantis, but I'd like to speak of it in a different way, because one of the things this gentleman here earlier said about what people say about a myth. Now they class a myth as being a lie. A myth is an untruth. That's a myth, so that doesn't exist, that's a lie. Now, in reality, myth is eternal truth. It is the opposite of what this establishment tells us it is. It is an eternal truth, and that's why our people spoke in myths, because they spoke in symbolism so that we can understand it without over and above language. Over and above language, because language changes, symbolism does not change. So they are able to pass this down to us through symbolism and mythology and stories, which can be understood by people whose language changes, but that underlying myth still remains the same. Now most people will think of Atlantis as in the Mediterranean. I'm not going to talk about the Atlantis of Plato. What I'm going to talk about is what I believe to be Atlantis of the North, a northern Atlantis. Now this, I believe, is important to our people anyway, because people who have studied certain, shall we say, backward tribes who are not technological like we are, have been around to these backward sort of tribes, and which they maintain is not civilised, and all these sort of barbaric tribes. And the one thing that these people will not give away is their own story. The reason they won't give away their own story is because they believe that if they do, that story or their myth is their origins and is them. It's like a tribal flag that stands for that people, for that tribe. And a myth is like the origins of a tribe. And these people believe that if you give that away, it can be distorted. Well, it seems clear that most of the mythology that's come down to us has been distorted. And it's been deliberately distorted. Because it's like the roots of a tree. You can cut the branches off and the tree will grow new branches. You can cut the trunk off of most trees and they will copy themselves. You cut the roots off and the tree will die. And a myth is our roots. And that is why I believe that the myth, like the myth of Atlantis, is important to us. Because another thing is that whenever we're taught in the schools, we're taught that we originated in Africa, that we all come from apes. But there isn't any legend that I could think of, I don't know whether anybody else can, of a legend of the European peoples originating from apes. There's not a legend that states that. In fact, all the legends speak to something totally opposite to that. Because most people believe that we started as apes, we worked our way up until we managed to create this civilization. Now, if that was true, then I don't think we got very far. I really don't. I mean, this is not a civilization, this is a degenerate civilization. This is Western civilization in its degenerate form. It's ruled by dark forces of chaos, decay, violence, all of this. This is not a stable society, it is not a civilization. And yet we are told that we've built this up from apes running around in caves up to the civilization we've got today. And I think it's about time that we sort of threw this idea on the scrap heap and started to look more rather into cyclic time than linear time. Because these people have imposed, the same people that we were talking about, the last speaker was talking about, have imposed upon us a different time scale, a totally different time scale. They've imposed linear time so that we're just going in progression. It's always progressing. But where's it progressing? We can see that it's not. The ancient people always believed in cyclic time. The history repeats itself over and over again. And that events in history repeat themselves over and over again. Myths in history actually repeat themselves over and over again. And if people were to study mythology, they would perhaps understand a little bit more about history. I'll give you an example. In early time, a couple of about 2,500 years ago, more than that, 2,700 years ago probably, when Rome was created, you've got two brothers, Romulus and Remus. Two brothers who rode white horses, who were both suckled by a she-wolf, which obviously sounds a bit outlandish, but we've got to look at that as symbolism, not as they were actually suckled by a she-wolf, but they were of a tribe that had a wolf as their banner, totem. Romulus slays his brother Remus, and he founds Rome. Then at the end of his life, Romulus goes up to the holy mountain over Rome, and he's taken up to the heavens. Now this appears before in Elijah and one or two other people in history. It appears over and over again, this myth. One brother is mortal, one brother is immortal. Now, something like 1,200 years after Rome was created, you've got a chap by the name of Attila the Hun, who slew his brother and founded an empire on the Danube. Now, to the seers of Rome, this must have been the bells of destruction for that civilization, because the same myth had been reenacted in history that had been reenacted for the creation of Rome. So you have that creative spirit, and you have that spirit returns to destroy that civilization. And again, since about the 12th century, you've got Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan kills his half-brother and founds an empire that destroyed a lot of the Arab empire, a lot of the Chinese as well, brought these down. So you've got, again, the same type of myth. Even here in England, we've got two brothers, Hengist and Horsa, who found the English nation. Both of them ride white horses, and both of them seem to be associated with the wolf banner. Probably because they were Bolsungers or Wolfingers, but or an offshoot to that tribe. So you see, myth can help us understand history. So the myth of Atlantis, I believe, takes us back to our very beginnings, because this was an advanced civilization in the past that existed at one time in the north, and seems to have been one time called by the Greeks Hyperborea. Hyperborea, there's a lot of Greek legends about Hyperborea, and it means beyond the north wind, or so we're told. In actual fact, the name Boreas actually means mountain, so it means beyond the northern mountain. But Hyperborea comes down to us in Greek mythology as the god Apollo rules over Hyperborea. Now Apollo was known by the Germanic tribes as Pol, or Balder. Balder, Apollo, Pol, or Fal. And one of his symbols was the Philfot, or the foal's foot. The Mersberg charms tell us that foal's feet were twisted, and that makes the Philfot, or the swastika. So the symbol of Apollo was originally not a sun god, but was a northern god, a polar god. And if we take the legend of Hyperborea and look at the symbolism of the number 7 in ancient times, we can see that these people would have been well to the north. Now, we don't know whether the North Pole is in the same place as it is now. So it's all right for people to say, well, it couldn't have existed at the North Pole because there's no evidence, but the North Pole can shift, and it has been known to shift. And also, the planet is off its axis by 23 degrees as well, which I'll go into later. But a civilization at the North Pole was said to exist where people lived for thousands of years, where they were a lot taller than me, anyway. But they were a lot taller, and they're talking something about 7-8 foot high, tall, and they lived in peace and plenty at a place in the North Pole that was actually a stable climate at this time. But we're told normally in Greek, people who study Greek normally tell us that the Greek stuff came from probably Egypt and across to Greece, but that's not entirely true, because the Delphic oracle was set up by Hyperborea. They have legends of Hyperboreans coming down from Greece and founding part of the Greek civilization from the north. The same as you've got the legends from India, which have now been traced back to a further northern origin and an Arctic origin. There's a lot of study been made into this, that the Aryans had originally an Arctic origin, and this would have been this land called Hyperborea. But there's another name for that land. Spanuth calls it Atlantis of the North. It's been called Atland as well, and the name Atland can give us a clue to what this is, because in the roots of our northern European race, much of it stems from the runes. And you've got a rune called Odal, or Ethel, and the Ethel rune means homeland, or inherited property, or inherited characteristics. In other words, DNA code, ancestral heritage, which is why the rune's been used for ancestral heritage. But the Ethel rune stems from an Indo-European root called Atal. So Ataland would simply mean racial homeland. It makes sense to see this rather than what some people see as a sort of Central American atl from water. Atal, meaning race. You've got Atlas, is the Greek god whose name will be Atalas, which is the racial ace. And the original stories about Atlas have him holding up the pillars in the far north. He came down to the Saxons as Ermin, where you get the Irminsul and the Armand. Ermin, the Irminsul pillar, was the one that was cut down by Charlemagne, and it stood for world order, and that was a pillar that stood in the far north, originally on Hyperborea. There are two ways of looking at this. One way is that this was a polar continent that sank, possibly due to a deviation of the axis. We don't know. But it seems to be through Iranian legends and that, from Iran, from the areas in Iran, that an ice age set in, and it destroyed this civilization by a massive big flood that then turned to ice, and these people could not live in this area, so moved south. The people moved southbound. But certain Greek legends tell us that Hyperborea could not be reached by land or by sea. Now, there's two ways we could look at this again, and that is, if you can't reach it by land or sea, you'd have to reach it by air. But then, of course, they didn't have aircraft in those days. But the thing is that in India and areas like that, they do record vimanas and aerial battles in the sky. And they also record that the Greeks, Avaris, who was a priest of Apollo, visited Greece from Hyperborea flying on an arrow. Now unless we just see him sitting on an arrow coming across from the north down to Greece, either that is a symbol that maybe they did have a way of travelling that hasn't come down to us, or we can see Hyperborea as being something that didn't actually exist in this dimension, because there is a well-known phenomenon called Fata Morgana, which is so-called illusion. Is so-called because of the ice that people see fantastic visions of a fantastic civilization past the North Pole and the South Pole, around about the polar region. Now they tell us this is an illusion, but the problem is that it's supposed to be because of the reflection of the light. But then if we look out here and look across the earth, this earth is round, but we don't see it round. So we're looking at an illusion by looking at that. And I think it's, I can't get the quote on this because at the moment I can't find it, but somewhere in one of Tolkien's works, he talks about the sinking of a continent that moved into another dimension and couldn't be seen from this dimension except by looking straight. In other words, by not looking as the earth is round. Now that's possible that this illusion that people are watching could be something that they are seeing in a different dimension. Now I know people don't believe in different dimensions, a lot of people don't, but it is a fact that you can see things through the corner of your eye. You can't see through the front of your eye. Now I don't know whether everybody gets these or not, probably not, but you can see things out of the corner of your eye that are not seen. So there is a way that can be, those things can be seen, like what one person will call an illusion because it's not there, and another person would say, well, it is there. So I don't rule out the fact that it's possible that these things are in a different dimension. Now, this, according to science, can't exist, but I think quantum science is just beginning to find out that it is possible that such a thing may exist, another dimension, because they talk about black holes, wormholes, and these sort of things. And I'll go into another side of this in a minute to do with science, but sticking with the Hyperborean legend, there are legends that this existed as a home of the gods, and that through the gods coming to earth as and taking on a clothing of matter, they mixed with races of men, lower races of men, and that created a fall. Now, more or less every single account of the legends of Hyperborea, Atlantis, Tolkien even says this about Beleriand, or which he calls Ataland in one of his, and Numenor. All of these are happened because of a racial sin where the gods mixed with man and mixed their divine blood, their blue blood, because they believed that they were blue-blooded, not the royalty now, you know, the ones that are all mixed up with the rest of the lot. But they did believe that they had a different sort of makeup, these people were originally. And there is a possibility why these things don't come down to us as physical beings, because most of them weren't physical beings in the first place. They were spiritual beings that mixed with men, and the earth was more spiritualised and things were different than they are now. This is one of the things that the evolutionary theories and that discount and cannot see that it's a possibility that the earth was totally different in olden times. It was not the same as it is now, because most religions believe that we fall into matter. It's like the Gnostic Christians. They believe that Jesus Christ had come down to redeem the spirited man because it had been locked into matter by the demiurge, who they called Ildabaoth, which means the child of chaos, by who they meant Jehovah. Jehovah was one of his minions, and that they had clothed the earth in matter, and that he came down to save the spirit of man. And that seems quite feasible, because in Hebrew his name does have the letter shin in it, which is spirit, whereas Jehovah does not. So it looks as if there was a legend, not necessarily from the Middle East, because a lot of these things come from further back than then. And the hanged god is far older than the God called Jesus Christ, and it's known all over the world, a god with the same sort of legends like Krishna, exactly the same legends, from much further back. And that this avatar came to earth in order to redeem the spirit of man, and he was crucified and destroyed by the agents and sons of matter. So if we think about this in the context of the fact that it may not be a world like it was now, Hyperborea or Ataland was a different sort of world, a totally different sort of world, with a different type of science and a different type of civilization. And it existed at the beginning. All legends state that this existed at the beginning in the Golden Age. The Golden Age was an age which was timeless. Time didn't exist as it did now, which is a possibility if that axis of the earth was not tilted, that time would be different. So it existed in a different time dimension. But it came to an end with a catastrophic change. Now most science now tells us everything's gradual change. Everything just gradually moves, and that's quite evolutionary, moves on. But the last tsunami tilted this earth off its axis by 1 degree. That's 1 degree, that's just one tsunami. And there's earthquakes been going on all over the place, tsunamis. If you've got catastrophes like that over a period of years, or even worse, it could tilt this earth even further off its axis, or further back towards where it was. So not all catastrophes seem to be gradual. These things can sink. There are legends of islands sinking beneath the sea, and you've got Tiwanaku in South America, which is so many thousand feet above sea level, with a civilization built at sea level with a port. So how did that get there? It wasn't millions of years ago, either. So we really ought to take into consideration that there's a possibility that the earth can change very, very quickly, not just gradually, and that continents can rise and sink through massive sort of earthquakes, moving of plates, the moving of the tectonic plates on the planet, which comes to us through the legend of the Midgard serpent. The Midgard serpent is at the bottom of the sea, and when that serpent moves, the ancients knew this science, because they knew that when that moves, it creates tsunamis, floods, earthquakes, massive tidal waves. The moving of the serpent, they called it. Science won't call it that, but they'll all the same, they know that this does happen. I think they ignore it to a bit, because I mean, if you've got plates in the earth, I should imagine probably that they need some lubrication, and probably all would do that, but I mean, taking that out, it's not going to do them much good to the plates that are still there, is it, when they move? So I don't know whether they're heading for disasters out of our sort of production and use of oil, but it's a possibility there. But it seems that this is what happened with the legend of Hyperborea. And from that legend, those people moved southwards and created another civilization, which has come down to us as the name, using the name Atlantis, which was a Western civilization. Now you can tell this sort of change that must have gone on, because first of all, these people were using a polar origin. So they would notice stars in the north sky across the pole. You don't see the zodiac from the far north, so they wouldn't have used a 12-sign zodiac. They would have used the 7 signs, stations of the pole star, because it takes 26,000 years to go through 7 stations of the pole star. And whereas it takes 26,000 years for the Earth to go through the 12 signs of the zodiac. 24 to 26 anyway. There's a dispute on that, which it is, but 24 to 26,000 years. So when we know that we use the zodiac, we know that because that movement from the north moved southwards. And so they could see the zodiacal signs and use those as a marker point. And they move sunwise through the year and anti-sunwise over through precession, which means through 26,000 years you go through one zodiacal sign. We're now moving into the age of Aquarius, which is the original symbol of the age of the Aquarius was actually the phoenix. It was a phoenix because that was a symbol of resurrection, Marfolk. So that's the symbol of hope for our people, is the phoenix and this age. This was the age when the Aryan race would be resurrected. But as I said, the movement from Atlantis. Now recently they found a massive landmass at the top end of Scotland, between there and Scandinavia, underneath the sea. It's just round about the area of Doggerbank, and although it's, I think they are still looking into it, and we're not going to get the truth out of this. You're not going to get the truth out of this, you guarantee that, because whatever they find that doesn't fit with their theories is going to have to be dumped in a museum somewhere and labelled unexplainable. Because they seem to have found underneath there stone circles, burial mounds, standing stones, exactly the same as on this mainland. Now we're told that all of these have been erected about, what, 2,500 or 3,000 BC. Now this is pushing this landmass was supposed to have been in existence from 18,000 BC to about 6,000 when it sank. One account saying on the same archaeologists and scientists states that this landmass sank gradually, and the other one says that it could have been sunk in a massive tsunami. Now, which one we take, I don't know. It's possible that there was massive tsunamis that sank part of it, and it's possible also that it sank over a period of 18,000 years, which shoves back their Stone Age for quite a bit, actually, when they talk about this. It shows their idea that we were primitive savages, because Stonehenge and that are not primitive structures. None of these stone circles are primitive structures. They had a use, and these people knew how to use it, and they knew the forces that were they were able to use through those stones. And sorry, mate.
Excuse us.
Mind the step.
Mind the step.
Mind the step. Anyway, I'll get many shows and sat your arse down.
Mind the step. It's the underground. We terminate there also. Oh.
Right, as I said, so they found this landmass. In actual fact, there's one of the German rune magicians. I've got a copy of one of Marby's books on runic stuff, and he actually states about this northern civilization, which he calls Atlant, in the 1930s, and that was well before that they'd found this underneath the sea there. They are still investigating this, but it means that some of the stories that Tolkien spoke of the English seem to be coming true, because Tolkien said that the English were here originally in these islands, and that this was also seen to be part of what was once known as Hyperborea or Atalant. It was part of Hyperborea, because they talk of the Hyperboreans being on an island with this massive sun temple, and that they worshipped Apollo. And as I said, Pol is the Long Man of Wilmington, just down the road is Polgate. Pol is the Long Man of Wilmington, or an aspect of Pol, and it's an aspect of Woden actually, but as the Pol or Vendel. But the Hyperboreans were supposed to have occupied the island, and Tolkien tells us that the English existed when this was not an island. Now it's just been proved that this was not an island. So what he was saying there, that people have taken as a story, he must have taken from ancient myths and legends, because he was an expert on Celtic and Anglo-Saxon mythology and Norse mythology, and so he knew what he was talking about. So if the English occupied these islands first, thousands of years before, then they are not just modern invaders of these islands. They were returning to the islands that they originally inhabited, well before, as part of what was called Hyperborea. And that is why I think that these legends are most important to us, because they trace back our history to a time when historians do not even know what was going on and refuse to even listen to legend. They didn't listen to the legend of Troy until they found Troy. They refused to listen to that legend until they found Troy. Not this Troy, the other Troy, you know, the one, the Trojan story. But and on the same type of subject, you've got the legend of Troy is very much like the legend of the wars in India, and this is where you get this cyclic sort of cyclic nature of the cosmos, because these last two world wars mirror the wars of Troy, and they mirror the wars going back into area in India, where they're talking about the Ramayana, Mahabharata. They're talking about weapons that can kill hundreds of thousands of people. How did they know this if something like that didn't exist? Now, I'm not saying that they had the same science that we've got here, because I don't think they did. Because I think they had a science that was totally different, but could be used for just the same destructive purposes. Because one of the legends of Atlantis states that after the Hyperborean continent sank, that a group of the northern people moved down further into what was known as Atlantis. But over thousands of years after this, Atlantis got like it did here. You had the same sort of dark forces that were taking over, forces that were just as destructive of where we are now inventing, that destroyed Atlantis. And at this point, there is a migration under Manu from Atlantis to the Gobi Desert. I don't know whether anybody's aware of the bodies they found in the China, who are obviously not, and they do, I mean, they could test these for DNA. They could test these for DNA if they wanted to, but they don't seem to come out. But they do, the characteristics of Northwest Europeans. Their characteristics are Northwest Europeans, and they could test it the same as they can test the pharaohs in Egypt and these sort of things, but they don't want us to see that. Yeah. And there's the Chinese also really don't want to say that, because, well, they weren't here at that time. Yeah. But these people seem to be a very, very late remnant of a civilization that existed in the Gobi Desert, before it was a desert, when it was a fertile area. And these people moved from the Gobi. When that civilization went down, they moved into India, Iran, and these people were known as the Aryans. But one of the things that makes this Atlantean legend different is that these people had a different state of consciousness than what we did. When they first moved to Atlantis from the very northern continent, there was a change in the way people were, a physical change. On Atlantis, these people began to develop what we now know as the I, the ego. We know that before this they had a sort of bicameral mind. They could hear the gods speak to them directly through a I think scientists now put a bicameral mind, and the gods could speak to them directly. But then they started to develop the ego. Now, we must have developed the ego for some reason, but legends tell us that this was because we needed to know the difference really between right and wrong. Because these Atlantean dark sorcerers were using powers that were destroyed, that had began to destroy Atlantis and eventually destroy the whole civilization. Which I'll go into this in a minute, the idea of this. The idea of a different force is important in this. A totally different force that science today recognises, or at least certain sections of science, the Semitic sciences, if you like. But it seems that we developed the ego so that we could see the difference between right and wrong, and that we could also recognise ourselves as individuals. Because they would have recognised themselves as part of a tribal group, and that the gods would work through them and speak through their minds, and they would be, the leaders would be actually doing the will of the gods. Now that's not unusual, because it still can happen now with people. People can still be guided, and certain people can be actually gripped by the power of a god to do something on earth, to change things. So when we developed the ego, it seems that a group of these Aryans were sectioned off and sent off into the mountains to the Sun Oracle to be initiated into the Aryan cults that then would bring out this different state of consciousness in mankind, in our people. And it was these people that then moved from there to the Gobi Desert. Today, we've moved further away from this, but we've moved into a consciousness that is totally not to be egotistical, materialistic, and where the ego has actually gone too far. But we don't want to get rid of the ego, because I think that that is a sort of childlike state that we were in, that we are now can evolve into something more when we can become godlike beings in the future, through strengthening the ego, making it immortal, just as the pharaohs considered immortality after death was because that's why they mummified their people, because they believed that they would go into the afterlife in that body. Not as physically, but as within that spirit body, if you like, put it in a bit better way, maybe. And that is why the Atlantis is so important to us, because that links us to the past and it also links us to the future. Now, I did speak about a force that they used, that the dark sorcerers seem to have misused, that destroyed Atlantis. And I think the best way to explain this is the science that we use out there today is an explosive science. Right? Now, Einstein's theory, basically, well, I'm not a physicist or anything like this, so I'm only going to put it in layman's term, common man's terms, is that energy, according to Einstein, energy is produced by the destruction of matter. Now that is quite logical, because if you light a fire, in order to light the fire and keep that going, you have to use wood, and it burns wood, so you destroy the wood. So energy can only be produced, according to their science, by destruction of matter. If you're using a car engine, you are burning oil, so therefore you are destroying oil or petrol, which is matter. You are destroying matter. Now that's according to Einstein's theory. But some sections of science now, mainly quantum science, has come up with something entirely different. And I think what it was, they froze atoms to such, I think about 300 degrees centigrade, below zero. And the atoms stopped moving round each other. All the parts of the atoms, the neutrons, all that stuff, whatever they call it. But what they did is moved in and out. In fact, they went and come back. So in other words, they've just proved that there are other dimensions. They moved in and out. And that science was known partially and being worked on in Germany before the war, because they called it science of implosion. Victor Schauberger Nikola Tesla, he was one of them. The Americans got hold of these people after the war and made sure that none of their stuff would ever be used because it would threaten the oil companies. Had people known what science knows and used it, and that is that something like the great percentage of anything in this universe is made up of what they call dark matter or dark energy. It's probably dark energy would be a better word for it. Dark energy makes up, you can't see it, you can't gauge it, you can't measure it, but this dark energy, quantum science know that this dark energy does exist now. Now the ancients symbolised that by the black sun. They knew about this, they symbolise it by the black sun. Well, in Germany, Schauberger and his son were working on anti-gravity through this implosive science. Whereas Einstein's science says energy has to be produced through the destruction of matter, through explosion, implosion says that this dark matter exists, has always existed, and always will exist, and it isn't created. It is not created. So therefore, it's just there. A free energy that's there if people knew how to tap into this, and it seems that the ancient people did know how to use this energy. They did know. Some people call it the odic force now, the vril force. It's the same type of energy. Vril, virile. Comes into Bovril, doesn't it? The name Bovril. Does. That's it. That's where it comes from, Bovril. It is Bovril. It's bovine vril. It's the, actually you probably find it, because that energy at one level's symbolised by the Urim, which is the Aurochs. They made it even, I don't know whether somebody did that for Bovril, but it is bovine vril, and they took it from Bulwer Lytton's so-called novel, Coming Race, yeah. But that is this force that they knew about, which is now known as dark energy or dark matter. But they know now, quantum science know that this does exist. So in other words, Einstein's theories are wrong. So we don't need oil, we wouldn't need anything like we do now, fossil fuels, because that energy, if we could produce it like they were working on, and they do seem to have been able to produce machines that could fly through this anti-gravity. They did find, I don't know whether anybody saw it, but they actually found a type of flying saucer in Sweden, under the sea in Sweden, with National Socialist markings on it. Yeah, they found it because at the end of the war they knew that these had been worked on, and that's where the Americans have got to the moon, because it was only through taking the German scientists from Germany over to America, Russia and to England and keeping them against their will that they've actually got science. But the one thing that they didn't get was the Atlantean science. They got the explosive science these scientists were working on, but it was secret groups that were working on the implosive science. So if there was a civilization in the far north called Ataland, our racial homeland, then it had an advanced science that puts us well beyond the Stone Age. And it is also possible, as in these ancient legends, that maybe they could fly, maybe they used a different way, maybe it wasn't the way we do now, maybe it wasn't as a physical science. If they existed as more spiritual beings, you wouldn't even be able to see any of this civilization. But you see, you can't. If you just think of the terms of matter, you cannot grasp that a civilization could exist differently than we exist today. That these people were different. And they weren't physical bodies. Throughout the ages, people have said about elves, spirits that can be seen. They've also talked about entering into the earth and going into a different time zone, where when they've come out, they've been, instead of being sort of there for an hour, they've been there probably years. And there must be something in these legends that hints that there are other worlds as well as this. There are other worlds. You've got the account of, as I said, that so-called illusion at the North and South Pole. But there was the Admiral Byrd who went to the South Pole with a fleet of an American fleet, which I think also there are probably Russians and British involved in it as well. And they came back. They went with a fleet thinking that there was Nazi bases down at the South Pole at the end of the war. That's what they went down there for, supposed to be. But they were supposed to have sort of gone over to look at this other beyond the pole ideas. But you wouldn't take warships for that, I don't think. Well, we don't know exactly what happened, but he left us an account where he went into a passageway. And then this being spoke to him in this passageway and said, "You are in the land of Ariani, the land of the Aryans." But this looks to me as if that's in a different dimension. And I know a lot of people sort of probably can't grasp that, but having had experiences, mystical experiences myself, that actually been taken into sort of different dimensional times, that I can see what a lot of these old stories are telling us. Because I've witnessed a lot of things, a lot of different things that people would probably lock you away for now, actually. But it's difficult for people to be able to sort of grasp it if you haven't actually experienced these things. Religious experiences is the same type of thing. But looking at the legends of Atlantis, I think you've got to see that this would get away from the idea that we come from apes. Now, we might have the same genetic makeup as apes, a lot of it, but that doesn't mean to say we come from them. It could be that apes are an abandoned evolutionary move. Maybe they're men that's descended to apes. This is another possibility that they don't take on. Their theory says that we've come from apes, so we must have moved upwards. But it's a possibility they're either that or they're genetic mutation from mankind that has created apes, or somebody's tried to create perhaps a slave race and gone wrong. And they're the remnants. So that explains why there is a likeness in the DNA. It doesn't necessarily mean that we've come from them. That doesn't make any more sense than it does. It's only a theory. All these peoples are only theories. What I'm telling you here is a theory. I'm not telling you it's truth. I'm just telling you this is a theory. Because I'm not telling you it's as absolute truth, because I couldn't claim that from thousands of years ago. But then they can't claim that from thousands of years ago. And there's other examples of sunken continents. There's in the southern Pacific, Lemuria. This was supposed to be a land occupied by a white race. Easter Island, we've got the southern and Central America, we've got the white gods in Central America, which they still can't fathom out why they're a legend. The white gods came over to Central and Southern America, one of whom was Wotan, the same name as Woden, or Wotan or Odin. Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan. There's even a figure, I'm not familiar with this civilization, so there is a giant in Chile, bottom end of Chile near the Peruvian border, that's got the same position as the Long Man of Wilmington. And that's the runic position. It's exactly the same position. It is a stylised figure. It's 300 odd feet tall. But it is a stylised figure. It's got exactly the same position as the Long Man of Wilmington. So when we look at this, we know the Vikings went to Southern America. We know the Vikings went to Southern America later on. Legends state that a giant race of white men created Tiwanaku. And we know that the white gods existed there. So we do know that all over the world, these legends link to, from one civilization moving from one place, being destroyed, and moving to another place. And a possibility exists, a lot of it, like in modern day, that these civilizations were destroyed by the same dark forces. And I think that's what really we should be aware of. That this is not a struggle that's just happening today, and it's not a struggle that's just happening over the last 2 world wars that have been caused, with all that bloodshed and all that sacrifice. Because this demiurge, or desert demon, feeds on blood and sacrifice and suffering. That's what this God feeds on, suffering. But we should be aware that this didn't just happen to us. This happened to civilizations in the past that were destroyed by the same dark forces, using certain elements of mankind as their agents. Now we know this as Zionism, Judaism, which is behind it. Judaism is behind Zionism. We shouldn't forget it's not just Zionism, because they've created so many different capitalism, communism, liberalism, so many different things that the trace has got to go back to Judaism itself and its racial religion, which is what they have done. They've turned race into religion, and they're an anti-race. And these forces have been working through the cosmos for thousands upon thousands of years. And it's the same forces that would have destroyed Atlantis that are destroying the civilization we have today. And if we don't recognise and pinpoint our enemy, then you're not going to be able to fight that. But if we don't go back to our roots in an advanced civilization, rather than Stone Age beings who have just gone up to what we are now and realise that we've gone backwards, not forwards. That our civilization started off as a godlike civilization in the very far north, moved through the ages, through the 4 ages, Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age and Iron Age. I think the Greeks had perhaps the best idea with this, because the Golden Age, gold does not tarnish. Gold does not tarnish. So that age was an age when nothing was tarnished. It was, everything was in common, if you like. No wars, no lack of food. And then you find that there's a legend that comes along, a culture bearer comes along. In English, this is Sheaf. Sheaf comes along. He comes in a boat sent by the gods. He brings with him a sun shield on the boat and a sheaf of corn, which his head lies on, and weapons in the boat. And we can see from this, if we read into this, with myth, you read into it. You read the symbolism. You can see that this figure came before the end of the last Golden Age in order to bring agriculture, because food would not be in plenty. In order to bring fire, he bought a lighted taper of fire, which is symbolised by the need rune. The need rune is the fire bow. This figure was something like Heimdall, Harmer, Heimdall. Harmer, Heimdall is one of those gods that incarnates on earth to bring the laws of caste, the laws of race, and also the divine laws of the gods. And also, he was a figure like Manu in India. You get one figure that appears just before a flood, a great flood. Now, there's another interpretation that we ought to think about with this, because although we can talk about a sinking of Atlantis, or a sinking of Hyperborea, or Thule, Thule, that's another name you can use for it. This could have been a sinking into the blood memory. That civilization sank into the memory of our blood. There's another interpretation for flood, is what people say, well, this island's been flooded with immigrants. It's been flooded with foreigners. We're overrun, flooded. So you don't necessarily have to take it all the time as a physical flood of water. It can be symbolic of a flood that destroys your civilization, or that flood out there is destroying our civilization. Now, I study the runes quite a bit. Are we okay for time? Sure. Sorry, I'm blabbering on, I think. So, I study the runes, and if you look at the runes, you'll see that the last 8 runes of the common Germanic Futhark are Tu, or Tyr, Tiwaz, which is the Sky Father. Then you've got Bekano, or Bilk, which is the Birth Mother. After that comes Man, or Manas. Manas is Manu. So you've got Sky Father, Birth Mother, gives birth to Manu. Manu appears prior to this flood, and Manu, which is the legend stems from India, brings back the laws of race, the laws of caste, the system of race and hierarchy. He imposes a system, very much like the SS imposed a hierarchical system in Germany before the war, but the Manu imposes that hierarchical system before the flood. Then you get Lagu, which is water, the flood. Out of the great deep then appears the Son of Man. This comes into Christian religion, but it predates the Christian religion and it goes wider than that. Ing is the Son of Man. So the Son of Man appears out of the waters, out of the great deep. And if anybody's seen like the legends like Beowulf, where you've got that film, animated film, he comes out of the sea, and in the song at the end of it, he comes out of the great deep. And even King Arthur, I think it was in, what is it, Wordsworth? I think somebody wrote about it, one of them. Same bloke, yeah, that's the one. Tennyson. He wrote about it from the great deep, which some people think was, you know, sort of, had nothing to do with King Arthur, but Arthur is a legend, a myth. That's a myth of the same figure. Manu appears, then you've got the Son of Man. Ing is the Son of Man. From there you get the Dag rune, or Day rune, which is the rune of day, the rune of the new dawn. And from that, again, you've got the Ethel rune, or Odal rune, which is the rune of Atlantis, rising from the sea again. So in the rune row, you've got a complete history on those last 8 runes of what's happened in the last century and what will happen through into the age of Aquarius, into the resurrection of our folk. Which is one reason why that I think that people would do well to study the runes, because they do have a complete knowledge of our people, and they do hold that knowledge for anybody who can unlock the secrets of them. Because we can go further than that, because you've got, as I said, the legend of Manu standing before the flood. You've got a piece in the Norse legends where it states that a mighty one came, matchless in strength. I don't know the whole quote, but he came, born of the wave maidens, and he was nursed and grew from the sap of the ground. Now that's Heimdall, or Hama. But it states that in the past tense. Then it states in the present tense that a great flood would come, and then the sweeping snows, and we get an ice age. In the future tense, it says an even greater one will come. Well, I believe that greater one is Vidar the Avenger. That's the son of Woden. That's after the wolf swallows Woden. Because that is I'm not, and don't profess to be, a expert on astronomy, but it is astronomical, because the greater wolf's jaws are actually a constellation in the sky known by the Norse people. So if anybody was aware of astronomy, they could actually probably work out roughly where this is, but it does seem to, those wolf's jaws do seem to encompass the centre of our galaxy. Look towards the centre of the galaxy and towards the pole as well. And that's why Vidar the Avenger seems to be Woden reborn as a god who steps down from the tree of woe as a warrior god to lead the folk to victory, to resurrection. Another important god to us is Bola, or Pol, because Pol is the polar god originally, and the sun god that was ruler of the Golden Age. And so the resurrection of Boulder means the resurrection of the Golden Age. To conclude, the importance of Atlantis is because that happened in the past, and its resurrection will happen in the future. After this civilization has totally collapsed, the phoenix will rise from the ashes of destruction, and a new race will be born. A godlike race. A race that's higher, far higher than this civilization that will take over. And I think that we should all be struggling for that now. We should struggle for that. That is our fight, to struggle for a new race. It's not just a matter of reviving a civilization, it's a matter for struggling for a new man, a higher man. Because you can't have a higher civilization without a higher type of man, because it can't work. And in order to do that, this has got to fall. Thank you.
Now I'm going to propose an executive decision to try and keep us on track. Will we now please take a break without questions and so on, because we're running behind schedule. And we'll all be back by 4:05 at the latest for Michelle